And I'm joined tonight by Kate Andrews and Nigel Nelson. Good evening to you both. Welcome. Let's start with the Guardian front page. Just really distressing. I mean, that's the only word I can come up with, the horror that is unfolding in Bucha. Nigel.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's absolutely horrific. I mean, what we're seeing now is because the Ukrainian army is now retaking ground, particularly in Bucha and Irpin. We begin to see the actual horrors that the Russian forces have committed. And so, I mean, we've got, pictures on the front page. You've been showing them on Sky News. You've blacked out some of the bodies lying in the streets. Actually, you can see them on the front pages. The Ukrainian army going in and having to swerve around them as these bodies are lying in the street. Question obviously is now, what can be done about it after the event? Will we be able to actually get those who are responsible for this before a war crimes trial, or indeed Boris Johnson's aim of trying to get Putin to The Hague to face charges?
Yes, and Ukraine's president saying that the Kremlin ordered this attack on his country, and it's a deliberate attack on civilians. I mean, that's as clear as day, isn't it, Kate?
It is indeed. For weeks now, we've seen the videos of the bombing and shelling of parts of Ukraine. We know that people have been injured, people have been dying from the aggression that Russia has taken against Ukraine. What we're seeing now, though, as Ukraine takes back these territories, and many of them are around the capital, Kyiv, is that the Russian soldiers have been committing barbaric acts against individuals as well. Nothing to do with military strategy. There are now reports and increasing evidence of torture, of rape. They're starting to find mass graves, and they're starting to find evidence that this is deliberately attempted to be covered up, the burning of bodies, which all fits with what we would understand to be deliberate war crimes. It's utterly horrendous. It's extremely difficult to look at these photos of men, women, and children who have been tortured and killed. One of the interesting elements of this, of course, is that at the very start of Russia's war, people thought it would be a matter of days before Putin took Kyiv. It's been well over a month, and now Ukrainians are taking back territory around the capital. This is strategically, from a military perspective, very bad news for Russia, but we are discovering what the soldiers have been doing there, and it is truly barbaric towards the Ukrainian people.
Yes, it is. And Ukraine's military released footage yesterday of what appeared to be a torture chamber in a basement, with a barracks in an adjoining room, and a line of bodies was found, hands tied and crouched, facing a wall. Nigel, you mentioned Boris Johnson saying that he wanted to take Vladimir Putin to The Hague. That surely has to be the only end result of all of this, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, the whole thing is to make that the end result. It will mean that Putin will no longer be president of Russia. I can't see any other way that you could actually get him before a war crimes trial unless there was a new regime in Russia. Now, that really isn't a matter for us. I mean, President Biden has had to row back on the idea that this is all about regime change in Moscow. So the question really is what Putin does next. That, in a sense, the biggest danger of all, I think, now is that he can't really fail in Ukraine. And so there's always the risk of worse weapons being used, possibly chemical or biological, to try and win this war. Now, it may be that we'll get something out of peace talks, especially if President Zelensky and Putin can actually sit down together. But it is difficult to see quite how the end game works without Putin actually going. But that's a matter for the intelligence services in Russia and the generals who have the power.
Yes, and we move on to the Metro, and they're describing the atrocities committed on the people of Ukraine as worse than those committed by ISIS. Worse than ISIS is the headline. Kate.
So part of the problem here is that the further Putin takes his aggressive acts and the worse that the Russian military acts towards individuals in Ukraine, the harder it is to come to the table and to go to those peace talks. And the harder it is to provide Putin an off-ramp, which could bring, some kind of stability back to the region. Because the more that we discover, the more difficult it is to negotiate with somebody who's committed these absolutely atrocious acts. And this kind of leads into the FT story I know we're about to talk about, but it also makes it more difficult to imagine us going back to any kind of neutral or remotely friendly relationship with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin remains its dictator because of these acts, because of what he's done. Even if, let's say, we can only pray that overnight Russia were to decide that it's made a huge error and completely retreat out of Ukraine. I still don't see a circumstance now in which the West turns around and says, actually, importing Russian gas is absolutely fine. We're going to lift all these economic sanctions. We're not going to worry about the oligarchs anymore. I think we are now in completely different territory. The world is going to be set differently from now on. And as long as Putin is in charge of Russia, most of the West, I suspect, will not be able to act normally towards that country again.
And Nigel, despite all the evidence, the pictures, the footage, most of it too graphic to be shown, Russia is dismissing this as being staged.
Well, I mean, we've got independent witnesses that this is actually happening. I mean, this is not just a claim by the Ukrainians. Reporters have been going in there. They've been arriving hours after the Ukrainian army did, and they've seen it with their own eyes. I mean, you've got the pictures on Sky News. So what we now have is this is not just a claim. We have proper evidence of genocide, of war crimes, and that's thanks to Western media being there. So I don't think that now there can be any doubt that these atrocities are being committed.
We move on to the Financial Times, as you mentioned, Kate, and this is really the economic war waged against Russia, the call for full sanctions, the calls for full oil and gas embargo, that being the only way that you can really dent Putin's attempts really to take over in Ukraine.
Well, having decisively decided not to put boots on the ground, the West is contributing through funding to Ukraine, supplying military supplies, weapons, but specifically with economic sanctions as well, as you say, waging that economic war in solidarity with Ukraine. But I think this is where we're going to see the increasing tension between Western countries, because so far that unity, while it was a bit wobbly at the beginning, has been very strong. But let's not forget, we have not completely cut off Russian energy supplies to Europe. The gas is still flowing because it would be extremely painful, near impossible for certain countries like Germany to overnight cut off those supplies. But now you have countries like Poland and the Baltics that are reporting to be pushing countries like Germany and France and the UK and the US to go even tougher on economic sanctions. They really want to hike tariffs on energy. And it will be interesting to see how this plays out, because these photos and images that we're now getting of the deliberate torture and rape and murder of Ukrainians committed by the Russian military is going to make it very difficult for any political leader in the West to suggest it's not time to go further. But the sanctions that were already being discussed were around closing loopholes, bringing in more individual sanctions against oligarchs, tightening up the central bank restrictions. And you've got countries like Poland and the Baltics saying, no, we need to go further. We really need to cut off that Russian energy. We really need to get them where we know it's going to hurt. That is going to be a debate with the Western European countries who are so heavily dependent on that energy at a time where the cost of living squeeze is already being felt acutely and is only set to get worse.
Nigel, do you think we've got to the point where the international community does have to take some of the pain to actually make a difference? The sanctions so far haven't stopped Putin. Do we have to take some of the pain in order for them to be effective?
Yes, I think we do. I mean, it is the only way. We all have to pay a price for this. It's not just us as individuals. It's got to be governments. It's got to be businesses. Businesses might start thinking about giving their workers a little bit more because of the extra cost of all this in wages. And I think what was interesting on the Financial Times report is even Italy, or there are calls in Italy for a total embargo on Russian oil, gas and coal. Now, Italy is one of the European countries countries which depends hugely on Russian gas. But I think there's a kind of mood now amongst European leaders. They've got to get together. They've got to really make the sanctions bite. And it's in the energy sector where that would actually work.
Now, I was going to say that this story is back on the agenda, but it's never really gone away, has it? Partygate. And the Times is looking at the fines that are to be handed out. Kate, take us into this.
This is the first set of fines that are being issued by the Met Police to Downing Street staff who we now know took part in a party the evening before Prince Philip's funeral. And as you say, this isn't a story that's ever gone away, but obviously the headlines have been dominated by extremely serious matters recently. It's an important reminder that while the Prime Minister is not thought to have been issued a fine yet, because Downing Street said that they will inform us if he is, his comments about what was happening in Number 10 when are seriously under scrutiny, especially as these fines are actually being issued. It would suggest that the Met Police thought there was enough evidence to actually dish these out. And depending on what happens with the headlines in Ukraine, frankly, I think will have a lot to do with how much traction the story gets, because this would have been on every front page before the humanitarian disaster that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine. As it happens, it's a small box on some of the front pages today. This is on page 2 of the Times. It isn't getting the same kind of press that it got before for understandable reasons, but it doesn't mean it's not still going to be a major headache for the PM. And something, there are more questions for him to answer in the coming months, regardless of what else is in the news.
Yeah, Nigel, what everybody wants to know is, will the Prime Minister be fined? What do you think the chances are of that?
Well, I mean, he was at a number of the parties that the police are investigating. So the chances, I'd have thought, are fairly high. His great defence at the moment is that because Number 10 is both an office and a home, he didn't actually break any rules because he was in the office bit when he was going to the parties. The same thing, of course, may not apply to his wife, Carrie, who, of course, can't use the same excuse. But what the Times is suggesting is that the Prime Minister probably won't be interviewed by the police. And the reason for that is they're just interviewing witnesses rather than people they're thinking of fining, which means, of course, that Boris Johnson is still in the frame for a fine if the police decide to do that.
Yes, we shall wait and see. And we move on to the Telegraph front page. Pictured there, actually, Helen McNamara, who received a £50 fine on Friday. And that's after police concluding that she broke COVID laws. But the story that we're looking at is COVID restrictions and the damage that they may have caused to the development of children. This is a report by Ofsted. Kate.
So whatever you think of the lockdowns, that they were too strict, that they weren't strict enough, that the government went too far, that they didn't do enough, there is no doubt that we are going to be living with the consequences of essentially shutting society off and then turning it back on several times throughout the past 2 years for a very, very long time. And this Ofsted report is one of those many examples, but a very concerning one. It's found that the COVID restrictions have left what they describe as a generation of babies and toddlers that are struggling to crawl and communicate, and they're behind in these critical skills because they didn't have the proper socialization and they didn't go through the same processes that they would have done in an open society. So they're finding that children have a more limited vocabulary. Some are struggling to respond to basic facial expressions because they weren't learning them in the way that they would have done without the lockdowns. It makes for extremely grim reading, and we're going to see things like this not simply for babies and toddlers, but for students as well, for young people, and what happened to the education process during lockdown. So expect more reports like this. There's a lot of catching up to do now.
Yes, it does seem that the young have suffered quite a bit during the pandemic, and the article talking about the fact that language skills have been delayed because simply many of them would have been communicating or looked after people who had to wear masks the whole time. Nigel.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's one of the most interesting things about this report, that they were actually being taught by adults wearing masks, and they've been taught, but for their whole lives. That's what they've gone through. We've known about what's been happening in schools and how far behind children have been there. Certainly, until I saw this, I hadn't really thought about what was going on for early years. But if you've got a situation where, with childminders, babies aren't crawling, and children can't communicate. It shows how far behind they are. Also, they spend so much time in front of screens, according to this report, they're even picking up the accents of people that they were watching. So it does seem to be their development has been really badly skewed.
Yes, it is. It is very sad. But how to make up for that time that they've lost is the question. Just very quickly, Kate, as you are an economist, we're going to look at the Telegraph business page and the price of milk set to rise. I was just actually admitting that I don't know what the cost of a pint of milk is, but then that's my excuse is because we don't get them in pints anymore. Kate, do you know?
Well, I live in an apartment on my own, so I get the baby ones, which are about 60. I imagine the cost of those are going up too. And I'm not an economist; I just write about it. But thank you for over promoting me. No, this is actually a very concerning story because if we weren't talking about Ukraine right now, again, we'd be talking about Partygate and the cost of living crisis. Everybody in the country, but especially those at the lower end of the pay spectrum, is feeling that squeeze. And for something like a critical, essential good like milk to be going up an estimated 50% because of the shortage that the dairy market is experiencing is going to be felt by everybody. And it's just one of countless examples of what happens when you have surging inflation, which we now have in the UK, which we have not managed to get under control and is certainly not transitory, as central bankers were once saying. It's something we're going to be living with for some time. And it is going to mean difficult choices, and that means difficult political choices too.